All right, I'm gonna pop my slides up here so that everybody can see them and we'll get started. Let's see. Everybody good? You can see them? And my sound's good?
I hope so.
Okay, great. I'm assuming yes, since you just responded.
I can hear you.
That's us. These are our Twitter handles. If anybody wants to tweet at us about us, hopefully nice things, whatever moves you. So that's us. All right. I'm going to give a quick overview of our time together. We have just 30 minutes. And then I know Jill Eisenberg from Lee and Low Books is going to chat, and then we'll kind of come back and do Q&A. I'm going to tell you kind of how we have decided, Laura and I have decided to frame our talk. It'll give you, I think, a sense of where we're coming from and essentially where we're going together today. So we want to take a couple of minutes at the beginning to think about the socio-political or socio-cultural context that shapes our interpretations. This will be important because, first of all, it was so lovely just to listen to Emily's talk, because I'm hopeful that we will build on everything that she shared. And I want to make sure I say first that I am not an immigrant. I am not an expert on immigration. That is not my area of expertise. My area of expertise is, though, however, thinking about literacy and language. And so thinking about how context shapes our interpretation is really critical to all of that. We're going to talk a little bit about the false dichotomy that creates competing narratives about immigration, good versus bad. Emily kind of hinted at this a little bit when she talked about some stories not getting told, right? And the most important stories not getting told. So we're going to think about that a little bit, and then what constitutes authentic storytelling and why it matters. I actually think Emily's did a beautiful job of making it clear why it matters. And I loved her insight on authenticity being very much about respect for the narrative. So we'll dig into that. Hopefully we'll offer something that builds on Emily instead of just repeating. And then the most important, the most fun part, right, is to get into examples of children's literature, the books we love and why. And then we'll take a couple minutes at the end to talk about implications for teaching, for learning, and for living, because our lives don't start and stop when we enter and leave a classroom, right? I mean, all of this impacts who we are and our development as humans. It's all tied to identity, again, as Emily shared. So we have like a little bullet list at the end that we'll share. So let me figure out how to click my slides. There we go. Okay, immigration and emigration. So definitionally, these words, I think everybody on this call probably knows this, understands this, has thought about this because you're here. But the words really come from this Latin root, which means to move from one place to another. It's essentially movement, right? Refugee, anyone who flees, right? But importantly, in the way that we often hear this word used is in reference to fleeing a country in order to escape danger, right? These are the definitions of these words. But what happens is that the literal definition matters less than how these words actually get used, how they circulate in our lives, and how those interpretations and those meanings that circulate then position different people, particularly in relationships to power. So when Denzel did my introduction, he talked about how a lot of my work, most of my work focuses on equity. And so this is part of it. It's always thinking about how does the language that we use, the stories that we tell, impact the way that a person is either denied or provided access to power. So we want to think a lot about the socially constructed meaning of these words, because words are symbols, essentially, right? Letters form words, and words take on meaning when they're used in context. And so this idea of an immigrant or immigration or an immigrant story really holds different meanings for different users. And so the stories that we share, the language that we use when we share these stories, how we talk about the immigrant experience is going to shape meaning and interpretation. This is true in classrooms, perhaps more than anywhere else. Maybe not. Maybe it's more true in media, but I can say it's very true in classrooms. So authenticity matters, because we want to think about who gets to shape that narrative, which is why I think I loved Emily's talk so much, because it's about not just shaping a narrative that affirms and values identity, but it's also what is the narrative that we're promoting that can disrupt the problematic point of view on immigrants or immigration. So let me say a little more about this here. We have two competing immigrant stories. If you have not seen either of these photos, I'm sure they are similar to other photos that you have seen. We have this one narrative on the left that promotes this idea of immigrants as heroes, right? And that's typically linked with the heroic Ellis Island arrival, right? Then we have, and this is obviously a more contemporary photo, this framing of an immigrant story as an invasion, as something illegal, as someone who doesn't belong, right? And so this goes back to this idea of power, right? Who gets to have access to the power that we have in the US and who is denied access to that power? It's important to think about these competing narratives and not dismiss them. I wasn't able to attend yesterday, but I know Denzel said there was a big conversation about colorblind racism. And that feels very important here, because I think sometimes we want to tell ourselves this story of being a melting pot. And we want to tell this story of, maybe whitewashing the experiences of people who come to the US as immigrants. But I think to really acknowledge and value these experiences, we want to get real with ourselves about the fact that we live in a country that privileges whiteness. We live in a country that privileges white supremacy. That shapes schooling. Curricular decisions, standards decisions, a lot of leadership decisions are made through the lens of white supremacy. So there's this narrative that gets privileged that is this bootstrap narrative that we live in a meritocracy and all you got to do is pull yourself up by your bootstraps because this is the land of opportunity. This narrative is typically reserved for white immigrants. If you notice in these photos, different race of the different immigrants who are captured, right? Who's documented in these images. Also thinking about recently the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. And as people were fleeing Ukraine, who was granted access across borders in places like Poland and who was denied. We saw so many stories, right, of Black people of color being denied access. So this is not a uniquely American problem, but we're here and we want to talk about how this plays out in schools. So what about the counter narratives, right? What about the narrative that says this isn't necessarily a meritocracy? These are complicated stories. These are stories that often get banned. And so this feels like it's becoming increasingly common. And so I just want to make sure we at least touch on it, because the three reasons typically that stories get banned: one, they have LGBTQ characters; two, they have characters of color; or this one's interesting, the books deal with Jewish or Muslim characters. Those characters may not be immigrants per se, but my guess is that the reason that people are challenging these texts and wanting these texts banned is because it's trying to limit this counter narrative about immigration in exchange for a celebration of the white Ellis Island story, right? We don't want other stories in schools. Just to give you a sense of the kinds of books that have been challenged, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just 7 books here from an epically long list of just the kinds of books that have either been challenged or actually banned from school libraries and classrooms. Okay. So part of what we want to think about today and unpack is this idea of immigration as a villain story. Laura, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, and it's I think Emily hinted at this, and I think it's something we wanted to make incredibly explicit. The idea of immigration as an invasion is not new, right? It hasn't happened. It's not like brand new 5 years ago with the prior president, like all of a sudden, oh no, we've had whites only in California, meaning there were signs that said like no dogs, no Mexicans allowed. Okay, that's been forever. We've got the Chinese Exclusion Act. We've got the Japanese Internment Act, right? We've got a ton of political cartoons over basically since we figured out how to print political cartoons in America, we have had political cartoons saying that immigration is a threat to our society. And it is just, we carry it with us, and we're carrying it with us up to this moment and the next moment, and it just simply continues. So,
however, yeah,
yes,
books can create opportunities. And I think this is almost exactly the phrase that Emily used. And so I saw the question in the chat about what do we do in the current political context? I don't have brilliant answers for that, because I find the current, like in Texas, as whoever it was in the chat, I'm so sorry, I can't see it because I have the screen share up.
Federico.
Okay, Federico. So we are distressed, to say the least, about how much censorship is happening in places like Florida, Pennsylvania, Texas. So we have some answers, but really it's about resisting everywhere that you can. So Laura, take it away. Let's talk about some books.
So I think this is one really good. So I don't know if you're all are going to be familiar with The Arrival. It was incredibly popular. It came out about 10 years ago now. It's Sean Tan. He's an Asian Australian. He wrote The Arrival. He does beautiful, sort of fantastical, fine art pieces that have this odd kind of magical glow to them. And The Arrival is a story told all in image. There's no words, or at least no words that are like I can read. There's some language in there that's, like it's illegible to me, who only can read English and Spanish. And it's basically about this guy, see the guy with the suitcase, typical Ellis Island sort of like, dude, right? And he goes to this foreign land where you see the little white, sort of weird monster-esque, cute monster. And it shows his effort to assimilate and migrate, and become part of this new society. Now, it is a very, very typical immigration story. It's a very safe immigration story. It doesn't talk about what he's leaving, or why he's leaving, or why he brings his family to the new place. And it doesn't really talk about any sort of political stuff. It's really about the very small moments in his life, figuring out language and custom and food, and how he survives it all and how he ends up thriving. But again, it's one man's story and how he deals with this. So again, it's an incredibly safe story to begin with. So that's why we wanted to say this is, and there's nothing bad about it. It's not a bad book. It's a great book. And this might be a nice way to enter into conversations about immigration in the more, restrictive communities out there.
Sorry.
Right. No problem. So she's in charge of the slides. So
and I'm doing a great job, apparently. Go for it.
It's fabulous. It's great. We are a well-oiled machine, folks. Right. And I think you can start with The Arrival. And again, it's a beautiful, it does not require any words. You're not going to be reading. It's all, interpretation of images. And when you go into interpretation, it really opens up discussions for whatever students are going to bring to the discussion. So it's a really wonderful book. Right. And we wanted to also talk about like Dreamers by Gigi Morales. I personally love this book so much. I listen, if I could marry a book, I probably would not be monogamous because I have an issue, but this would be on the top 10 list. I love this book so much. The colors, the vibrancy, the story, and the cute little baby. You see the baby in the front? He's so cute. And it tells a story of a woman who comes across the border into America. She's Mexican, and how she learns to read. It happens to be Gigi's experience of learning how to read and speak English in America. She learned how to read and speak English by visiting the library right? It's also a love story to a library, which, who doesn't love that? You know, um, Mango, Abuela, and Me. Again, this is a story of a Latina, and this is the abuela comes from, I think, Puerto Rico, right? And the girl and her abuela don't speak the same language. They have a language problem, right? Where they're having a hard time communicating and connecting. And, this goofy ass parrot is what helps them, right? And again, it's beautiful and it's fun, right? We have to get out of the idea that all books about serious subjects have to be devoid of joy and life and fun, right? And I think it's important to have two very bright, beautiful, lovely, loving pieces, and then a different pond, which is Taibu, and it's so good. If you have not picked it up, please, right now, like, stop listening to us and go to your library site and order this book, because either your library needs to have it or it needs another copy because it's so good. And it shows, again, it's this beautiful story of this father and son. They wake up very, very early. You can see the starry sky, to go fishing. It does show a family who is food insecure, and they are dealing with it in a way, right? And the son goes on, goes with his dad to get food for the family. And and it's told with love, right? And that's important. Okay, go to the next.
Yeah, I want to just add on to this really quickly too, because I think one of the things that Emily said in her talk was that this idea of motivation being a sort of trait or quality that is valued in school, right? And so she told her immigrant story and asked us to identify where we saw examples of motivation, passion, persistence. And so motivation for reading is a thing that's studied all the time. Reader motivation and engagement is a big piece of understanding literacy development. And so one of the things that I noticed about her story that motivated Emily was her family, her love for her family. And so you'll notice too that all these stories really highlight beautiful relationships, intergenerational relationships. And so I just wanted to also flag that, because I think it's about expanding and enlightening the immigrant stories, but also thinking about what is motivating to the reader.
All right. And then I love a good biography. I have a t-shirt on right here that says, do not erase, or don't erase history. Biographies are a great way to bring history in a way that's person-centric, right? And so these are just a few of them, right? I will say, I'll just shout out Paula Yo. Paula Yu. All of her books, right? I love Paula's books. She has a couple of picture books, and she has a couple of larger YA novels, and she's got a graphic novel coming out. Anything that she writes, I think you should read. And again, it should just be something that you have in a classroom. If you can center it in your curriculum, fabulous. If you can't, just have it for people to get and learn some history yourself. Okay, which one of these do you want to talk about?
Well, I guess want to say, here's what I'm going to say about it, is that instead of highlighting like the specific stories, because I'm kind of trying to keep up with the chat, and it seems like people are familiar with some, or they want specific suggestions. And so I'm just going to add the following, is that you are probably teaching biographies in your classroom, right? This is something that is in the standards. It is something that's expected that we're teaching in history classrooms, perhaps definitely the English language arts classrooms. So use the biographies, like these types of biographies, where all you're doing is teaching biography. It's what you're supposed to teach. It just so happens to be that the book, the text that you are using to teach that particular form also expands what we may be thinking of in terms of immigrant story. It lends authenticity, and it maybe disrupts that prevailing narrative that we so often see in some places where the immigrant story is limited to something like invasion, right? And not of belonging. So I just always like, and whenever I can, whatever I'm teaching in English language arts, I try to choose a text so that I can do equity work, but in a sneaky way. So these are options for that. All right, go for it. Okay, so somebody just asked about Island Born, I think, and that is on this slide. Yes.
Okay, so Rudine Simmons Bishop talked about windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, right? And so that's like any one book can function as a mirror reflecting a reader's experience. A mirror reflecting a reader's experience. A window, in other words, we can sort of peek in at somebody else's experience, or something, if it's a really great piece of literature and the reader is ready for that piece of literature, it can be a sliding glass door so you can go and visit that place, right? And these are some of our favorite. I will say Island Born, I want to put a caveat. Now, I love the book. I was involved in some of the changes to the images. The first time it was published, it's the story of the Dominican Republic's fight to fight against the totalitarian regime. And the first time it was published, it was a bat that looked like the regime, big bat, and it was a black bat. And a lot of us said, listen, we got to stop this whole black equals bad thing, especially in a place like the DR. And so the publishers actually went back and they canceled that printing, and they made it it's a very sort of like camo green color. It's really good. I think it's important that we look at, especially when we're working with students and picture books, those kinds of image tropes, those kinds of messages that we send through the images are incredibly important. So and Andrea, want to talk a little bit about the name jar. So
yeah, okay, great. I was sort of torn between the Jacqueline Woodson book and the name jar, because
I love Jacqueline Woodson always.
Well, right, that's what I was going to say. And I know they talked about Showay earlier today, and I just wanted to also add in The Day You Begin, which is also a wonderful book, which again, not explicitly about immigration, not explicitly about newcomers, but is about that. And so it's a way that you can just stimulate conversations in your classroom, normalize a more expansive narrative about what it means to be a newcomer, what it means to be an immigrant. So the name jar, I just want to share, and I got to tell you again, I mean, I feel like this whole presentation is like shout out to Emily, but she spoke about going by Emily because her name is Astrid. And so if you cannot say it that way, she doesn't want you to say Astrid because that doesn't feel good. That's not her name. And so she builds her identity from the name Emily. I loved that. And it reminded me of the name jar because Laura and we like the name jar. Again, nothing wrong with the name jar. I always thought of it as a little bit basic, right? But names are so important, always, right? And this book I've changed my perspective on this because I use it in my classrooms at Boston University with adults, right? They're teacher ed candidates, and we use this book in our interactions with children. But we have a lot of Chinese and Asian students in our classes at BU. It's Chinese especially. I just feel like that's the majority of our students that we have at BU. They're here for school. They're here because they went to high school and then college, or they're just here for college. So very connected to their language and cultural practices and to their families back home. And so many of them read the name jar, and it changed their perspective on using Anglo names in America to make things more palatable for us, basically, right? And that there was this idea that they realized that by changing their name or going by a different name, they were really participating in this assimilationist point of view, or this assimilationist way of being in the world. And they kind of like changed their perspective on it. which made me change my perspective on how powerful a really simple story can be, because these are adults. And if that happened for adults, certainly this can happen for children. But it goes back to, we read the books, we provide the opportunities. We're not telling people how to think. We're not saying you should never have changed your name and you should be going by Susan instead of your Chinese name. It's basically saying, what do we think about this? Do we see ourselves in these stories? Does it change the way that we might think about what should sort of count as a legitimate name or a legitimate identity, I guess really is what it is. Here's a few more, all about names, but also this will probably be our last slide before we get to our implications. Talk about, you want to talk about it? The crowd is blue. We're going to share. We're going to make ourselves vulnerable.
So here's what happened to us. So first of all, I'm Latina, right? My family is from Mexico. All right. I am white presenting. I am the assimilationist dream. Assimilation is really problematic for me and my family and my family's history. So I know a lot of people in America look at assimilation as like the gold standard, and it's a very problematic idea. And it leads to this idea, right? So we were looking for books and we both love The Proudest Blue. And we're like, oh, we have to include that, right? And then we're like, wait, do we? Hold on. Why do we think that's about? And then we started remembering what the book was about. We had to look up online where Muhammad is from. And it turns out, like,
Jersey.
What is she? Like from Jersey?
She's from Jersey.
She's from Jersey.
Born. She's American born.
And it was our bias, our, Americanness, our assumption that anybody who wears a hijab has got to be foreign, right? And that is something, and we wanted to share this because I think too often experts, and I'm going to use scare quotes, right? Experts come in here and into these spaces like, we know it all, we're fabulous. And we do the same nonsense as everybody else, right? And so we just know how to check ourselves.
Right. I feel, and that's why, we wanted to give lots of book suggestions and talk about the books, but I think essentially what we're trying to talk about today is bringing critical lenses to thinking about the books that you're choosing, really examining what story about immigrants or immigration am I telling in my classroom when I choose different types of books? Am I talking about it, or am I sort of concealing it because it's a topic that feels too taboo? Or really importantly, am I telling stories of and celebrating stories of assimilation? Because I think we do it unwittingly sometimes because these are the stories that are so common. These are the stories that the whiteness of American schools love to tell, but they're really harmful to young people's identity. And that was like my biggest takeaway from Emily's talk, was that she literally dropped out of high school before she met someone who was able to see her potential and help her optimize that potential. So really thinking about the choices that you make in your classrooms can have a big impact, not just on the students in your classroom who are newcomers, but on actually starting to shift the narrative around what counts as being American, who's here, who's legitimate, right, in our classroom, but also which cultural and linguistic practices are valued. One of my hopes, which is the last bullet point here, is that the more that we share and engage with diverse texts, and particularly stories, like sort of multicultural, diverse stories, we start to shift as a culture, even if it's just a school-based culture, what we think counts as legitimate linguistic practices and cultural practices. Letting kids bring in their home languages, their native languages, in order to do the intellectual work that they're doing in classrooms. There's so much research that shows that benefits students, right? English only is not beneficial to learning. It's beneficial to assimilation. So just a few others. I think I have 2 minutes. So we'll say this. Laura said it. Learn history. No one knows everything. We're not experts. I'm not an expert on history, and I'm not an expert on immigration, but I've become an expert on learning what I don't know and being open to thinking about the choices that I make, the language that I use, and how that may limit or expand opportunities in classrooms. So yeah, choose the books that are age appropriate counter narratives. I know there was some concerns about some of the books, particularly The Arrival, right? You know your students best. You're an expert in that. So you can be discerning in the texts that you choose and make sure that they are age appropriate, but use them to teach skills and strategies, standards aligned curriculum. You're not just using them to tell the story of being island born. You're using Island Born maybe to talk about character development, maybe for retelling, right?
Food.
Right. There's so many things that you can be using, so many books that you can be using to teach the stuff that's what we're supposed to be teaching. Yes. And then engaging in rich discussions, because kids will surprise you. You all know that.
Yeah, they will bring.
Right.
All right.
Also, let me just say this, keep in touch with us,
Yeah.
especially if you want book suggestions, that's us. Laura and I have a center that's launching called Educating Critically. I think our website will be live next month. So check us out. We want to stay in touch with you.
Speaking of knowing our history, we just presented ILC's newest lesson plans, looking at the role of immigration throughout our history. Good place to start. And we do have one question from Elaine before I hand it over to Jill. Can you name any books that specifically show the strengths that immigrants contribute to their destination countries? And I do also want to caution that, does that tap into the good, bad immigrants?
Yeah, so I'm sure, I don't know off the top of my head, Laura probably can do this off the top of her head because she keeps a card catalog in her brain, but I just want to say this, is that that's part of the reason that we wanted to share those lesser known biographies, because sometimes this idea that in order to be seen as valuable, you have to be exceptional is something that we kind of want to get away from, right? We wanted to celebrate like, hey, you love your grandma, I love my grandma. And so we're going to tell those stories, but that's not to say that we shouldn't be celebrating contributions. So we can think about that, but it should really be okay just to be a regular person. That's humanizing, I hope.